Hello, this is Andrew Womack, and welcome to a very special Gospel Truth edition. This is our Monday's edition, and God has done something really special for me. He spoke to me on the 5th of March, 2021, and told me some things that have just changed my attitude dramatically. I think that in hindsight, I'm going to look back and see that this was a deal changer. And since He spoke these things to me, I want to share them with you. And so today's program is just going to be sharing with you some things that the Lord recently spoke to me. And I'm going to bring on David and Tim Barton the rest of this week to give further amplification and clarity on this. But what I want to share with you is on March the 5th, I was in Oklahoma City at a meeting that was called The Encounter. My niece and nephew put this on along with some other Charis Bible College graduates, and it was just a meeting. Lance Wallnau was there ministering with me. And anyway, on Friday night, March the 5th, we were just worshiping the Lord, and I tell you, the power of the Lord was present. And I was so pleased to see that my niece and nephew, are just kind of beginning in ministry, and there were about 800 people there. And they are starting kind of where, I've arrived after 50-something years of ministry, and I was just so excited to see people coming and things happening in the maturity that they were operating in. And so I was standing there during the praise and worship, and we were singing this song about the goodness of God keeps running after me. And I was just praising God and thanking God for, the encouragement of seeing the younger generation come along and take up the banner and preaching the gospel. And I was just really excited and praising God. And as I was worshiping the Lord spoke to me. And He said that there are some people in this auditorium who in the future will be telling the young people of their generation about what it was like to live during the Third Great Awakening in America. Now, that's a terminology that I normally wouldn't have used. I might have used the term a revival or a move of God or this new wave or something like that. Those are terminologies that I'm more familiar with. To me, a Great Awakening goes back to the first and the second Great Awakening that happened in the United States. The first Great Awakening was back in the, the 1700s. The second Great Awakening was in the 1800s. The first Great Awakening is what occasioned really this nation coming into being. And again, this is the reason I'm going to bring David and Tim Barton on to share, because they're authorities on this and they will be able to give a lot more clarity to this. But anyway, it's just not a terminology that I would have used. I was familiar with it, but it really speaks to me that this wasn't just my own thoughts. This was God speaking to me that we were going to have a third Great Awakening. So I said, God, are you saying that we are going to actually see a third Great Awakening? And before I get to the reply that He gave me, let me say this, that 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14 is a familiar passage. Most people have heard this, that if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sins and heal their lands. Man, I have prayed that scripture. I couldn't even tell you how many times. But here's the problem I had with that. It says, if my people, not if my person. This isn't something that just one person can do. It's talking about the body of Christ, and they have to humble themselves. They have to pray. They have to seek His face. And even though on a personal level, I have humbled myself and I've prayed and I've sought His face and I've turned from my wicked ways and I've shared the gospel with millions of people. And I have seen thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people touched. And I'm seeing great things happen on an individual basis. I didn't have any confidence that on a national level or even an international level that we had met those qualifications, because it is a conditional promise. And only God knows if those conditions have been met. And so even though I have been praying and ministering and trying to touch people, and I'm very encouraged seeing individuals touched, seeing myself and the way that God has dealt with me. I'm just thrilled with what God's doing in my life. I've been seeing many people's lives touched, and I'm thrilled with those on an individual basis, but I had no certainty, no assurance that on a national level that we were going to see this nation turned around. So when the Lord said that there were people in that room that would be telling the young people of their generation that we were, what it was like to be a part of the third great awakening. Man, that excited me. And I said, God, are you saying that we are going to have a third great awakening? Have those conditions been met? Is it going to happen? And when I said that, I mean very clearly, the Lord spoke to me and He said, no, it's not coming. It's already begun. We are already in it. And I just can't tell you what that's done for me. Again, this is what my whole life has been fighting for, is to see people changed, with the belief that if we see enough people changed, it could change nations. It could change the entire culture of the world. And so this is what I've been fighting for and moving towards, but I had no certainty that we had met those conditions and it was going to come to pass. But now I believe I've got a word from the Lord that it's already happening. And I know that there's many of you watching this program that God didn't speak this to you. He spoke it to me. And so you're listening to this and you're observing as a third party, and you'll have to evaluate for yourself whether or not you believe this is true. And I can understand that because God spoke it to me and not to you. And if you only look in the natural, there are so many bad things happening. I could go through and enumerate them, but most of you are very well educated on all of the ungodly things that are happening. It seems like the ungodly are gaining ground every single day, that things are happening that I never thought would happen in my lifetime. And if you only look with your physical eyes and listen to the bad reports that are being put out over the propaganda networks today, well, then I can understand why you would say there is no evidence of it. But I believe God has spoken to me. And since I've gotten that word, here's one of the scriptures that immediately came to mind. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in verse 58, it says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, forasmuch as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." And you know, again, I've been laboring for 53 years, and I know that my labor is not in vain for myself. I can see evidence of God's blessing on my life and ministry and things that we're doing. So on a personal level, I'm encouraged. Ministering to individual, I have seen thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives changed, and I get reports and I'm encouraged in all of that. But on the national, on the world scene, honestly, I haven't had the confidence, and I've wondered, is all of our labor in vain? You know, if I had time, I could just show you in history that even though it's always God's will for people to come alive to Him and respond to Him, He does it through people. And there's many scriptures that talk about that if we don't do our part, we're the salt and we're the light of the earth. And if we don't do what we're supposed to, then what is the earth going to be salted with? God isn't going to move sovereignly outside of people. That's a wrong concept that people have. God is sovereign, but sovereign doesn't mean independent. He doesn't move without us. It says in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, "Now unto Him who is able to do exceeding abundantly above all we ask or think, according to the power that works in us." It's wrong to say that God can do anything above all we ask or think, period. No, it's according to the power that works in us. God flows through people. And I just didn't have any certainty that on a national, international level, that we had risen to the occasion and that we were giving sufficient resistance to all of the evil that's coming. But now I have a word from God. Again, I understand if you are skeptical about this, but God spoke to me, and so I'm sharing with you, and I believe that this is going to resonate with many of you, and that it's going to encourage you. And what it did to me, it just showed me that now I've got a word from God. I don't have any uncertainty about whether this ungodliness and the transgenderism and the homosexuality and the abortion and the pro-death and just, I could go on naming things. I don't have any uncertainty about whether or not we are going to be able to push this back and win, because I believe that we are experiencing a third Great Awakening. Let me share this with you out of Ezekiel chapter 47. And this was where Ezekiel had a vision of these holy waters coming out from under the sanctuary. And I won't go through and read this whole thing, but there was an angel there, and this angel had a measuring rod, and this angel told Ezekiel to measure these waters. They flowed out from under the south side of the sanctuary, and everywhere that these waters touched, they were healing waters, and anything they touched, it was healed. It says specifically that there were marshes and pools that it didn't touch. I think that's really significant, because some people think that when you have a great awakening, a move of God, or a revival, that it just changes everything. We're going to hear from David and Tim Barton in history that isn't so, that there was always resistance. And in some ways, when you have a great move of God, it actually causes the evil people in desperation to stand up and push back and fight back. It's not the way that a lot of people think it is. There's gonna be opposition, and there will be bad things. And so in this illustration, there were still marshes that this healing water didn't touch, and they were stagnant, and everything in them died. But this water began to flow out from under the sanctuary. And look at this. It says in verse 2, it says, "Then brought he me out of the way of the gate northward, and led me about the way unto the other gate by the way that looketh eastward, and behold, there ran out waters on the right side." Anyway, I could spend time explaining that, but that's talking about the south side. And then in verse 3 it says, "And when the man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he brought me through the waters, and the waters were to the ankles. Then again he measured 1,000 and brought me through the waters. The waters were to the knees. And again he measured 1,000 and brought me through the waters were to the loins, to the waist. Afterward he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass over, for the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a river that could not be passed over." And the reason I bring this out is to say, of course, this is symbolic. This is not an actual river. The whole thing, if you were to read it in context, is talking about the latter days, and it was prophesying. I'm not certain that it's talking about the day we're living in it, but it is exactly descriptive of what I felt like the Lord was telling me, that we aren't going to see a great awakening. We're going to see it in a greater degree, but right now it may only be up to the ankles. It may not be very deep. You may have to look for it. It may not be evident, but it is going to continue and increase, and it's going to get up to the knees and then to the waist, and then it's going to be such a powerful, mighty move of God that you won't be able to cross over. You won't be able to avoid it. And I really believe that I now have a word from God on this. And I am not putting my head in the sand and denying that we have all kinds of problems, and that there is a push by the devil, the spirit of Antichrist, like I've never seen in my life. I'm not denying that any of those things exist, but what I'm saying is, I believe I've got a word from God, and I wanted to share it with you and encourage you that the great awakening of God has already begun. And there's evidence of it everywhere. And so I have had this confirmed in a number of people. One thing I did not say yesterday is that I sent out an email about this to some of my partners. And Dwayne Sheriff, who many of you know, I've had him on my program. He was writing a book. And in this book about counterculture, he was talking about there is coming a third great awakening. And the Lord just stopped him and said, that's wrong. And Dwayne just stopped like, God, isn't there going to be a third great awakening? And he said the Lord spoke to him very clearly, no, it's not coming. It's already here. And then the next morning, he got my email about it, so he told me about that. And I really believe this is significant. It's going to make a huge difference in everything I say and do. And one of the very first things I did was call Wall Builders, David and Tim Barton. They're my guests today because they are just experts in American history. And I wanted to bring them on to give us some understanding about what the first and second Great Awakening were like and how what we can expect, how to respond to this, get their opinion, whether or not they feel the same way. And so I know your answer, but let me start with you. This is David and Tim Barton of Wall Builders. They're from, is it Aledo, Texas?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I've been to their museum. If you haven't been there, you ought to go see it. You got the largest collection of original American documents outside of what? I guess.
Well, we're told it's the largest private collection of founding era materials outside of Washington, D.C., Smithsonian, and National Archives, et cetera.
So if you haven't heard them, by the time you get through with today's program, and I'm going to have them on multiple days, you will be wanting to get their materials. So you can go to wallbuilders.com, right?
Yes, sir.
And they got all of that there. But let me just first of all say, so how do you feel about what I think the Lord spoke to me about us being in a third Great Awakening?
About 20 years ago, and let me answer it by first saying, Great Awakenings historically run for decades. And if you take the first Great Awakening, call that, it's 1730 to 1770. You take the second Great Awakening, it's about 1801 through maybe 1870 thereabout. So you're talking decades. So it's interesting that people in the Great Awakenings didn't know they were in Great Awakenings until historians wrote about it after the fact. Very few people saw that they were in a revival when it was going.
So they probably wouldn't have called it that themselves.
They did
That's
not.
Historians.
It's historians who said, hey, did you see what happened back there for those several? Let's call that an awakening. So it's interesting that a lot of times we don't recognize. However, 20 years ago, I was sitting in the office of the Majority Leader of the United States Congress in the House of Representatives. He had shortly before become a Christian. He was passionate about the Lord. And for about a year and a half, I didn't see him anywhere in Congress, but what his pastor was with him and just discipling him, mentoring him, and it was really good. And so we were sitting in his office one day, and he said, I think we're in a Great Awakening. That's 20 years ago.
Wow.
I said, really? He said, yeah, look at the stats. And he said, here's the growth of music across the country. And here's the growth of Christian music across the country. And it was just exponentially higher. He said, here's the growth, average number of websites coming up. Here's the growth of Christian websites coming up. And so he was showing me all these stats that he had put together that just exponentially were Christianity was skyrocketing at the time. And so he thought back then we were in a Great Awakening, and I didn't disagree with that. And I think we're in one now. I think statistically there's ways of proving that. But there's a lot of other things that go with the Great Awakening that's not always so pleasant either. And it makes me think of that proverb that, well, if there's no ox, the stall is clean.
Where there is no ox, the crib is clean.
The crib is clean.
But
There's nothing to clean up after.
Is by the strength of the ox.
That's right. If you got an ox in there, you're going to have a mess to clean up along the way. But that's where you get your productivity, is what that ox can do. And so with a revival, often goes a lot of mess that has to be cleaned up. A lot of, we'll talk about as we go through this, but there's a lot of things that people don't want to hear as being part of a revival or Great Awakening. But it takes that to turn it around, and it's not an effortless change. It's a lot of change. So I think we're in a Great Awakening. I think we have been for a while. I think there's some good statistical indicators.
Well, it doesn't look like it if you're just watching the 10 Spies Network. I got that from David. When I went to the U.S. Capitol, and they have a tour where they bring in preachers and they give a tour of Statuary Hall and talk about all of the godly people, and they go through those pictures that are in the rotunda and discuss that. And they had speakers come in from the representatives and stuff. And I was so blessed. I thought, man, there's a lot more going on than I realized. And you spoke to me and said, you've been listening to the 10 Spies Network.
That's right.
And so I've co-opted that, and I use that
That's
a
great.
lot
Well,
because that's
it wasn't
true.
mine. It's biblical, as you know. So
Yeah, but that is true that we aren't going to hear this reported
No.
in our news media because they have become liberal. And even the conservative news media only reports things from a conservative standpoint, but they're still talking about all the bad stuff. So they aren't going to talk about the good stuff.
And there's a lot of limitations based on the information people have as to what they disseminate, right? It's one of the challenges even now when we look at Christians and culture. If you've been educated at secular universities, you probably have a lot of secular thoughts in your head, even though you might love the Lord because you've been getting the same bad information that the rest of the world is getting. So even some of these conservative, so-called news outlets in some situations are repeating the same stream of information. But Andrew, even as you pointed out that not only is the good not being identified, one of the things that can also give confirmation of the fact that arguably we are in a third great awakening right now is some of the negative that is happening. Because historically, in the midst of awakenings, there's a lot of conflict that happens throughout the awakenings. If you go back to the first great awakening, there were denominations that split because of different theological perspectives from first great awakening. Second great awakening, leading up to the Civil War, a lot of denominations split. Now,
You could say, in a sense, that the Second Great Awakening caused the Civil War.
Very much. You could make a very strong argument that the First Great Awakening is what prepared the American people, unified them, put them in a position for the American Revolution. The Second Great Awakening is what prepared the American people for the Civil War. And this is something, as we are looking at the conflict in culture, this is actually a pretty good reason, maybe affirmation, that when you're seeing division among the debates of theology that should be very clear and settled, that God said he made them male and female, right? Gender should not be a confusion or a debate
No, it shouldn't.
in culture today. But the fact that you now have churches that are debating over human sexuality or gender, whatever the case is, these are things that should be very theologically clear. And right now, it's almost as if you look at some of these great awakenings, the first, second, third great awakening, it's almost as if there's a sifting of the wheat and chaff happening on some level, that you have a choice to choose what side you're going to be on. And a lot of times, even at the end of the first great awakening, there were a lot of people who were in opposition in the first couple of decades who finally swung around to the right side as revival was beginning to spread, and they were seeing the impact it had. One of the things that, as we identified, sometimes you can live in the midst of an awakening and not even know you're in the awakening. But pastors who were there talked about they would see the change of people. New England from 1740 to 1742 went from 25,000 active church members to 50,000 active church members.
Wow.
So the pastor said...
Now, again, that doesn't sound impressive, Dave.
No,
You got to
that-
remember how small the population in
that's
America
double.
was.
Correct.
You doubled it. And so,
awesome.
that'd be like a mega city today doubling. That'd
Well,
be massive.
and to that end, you look in California, which has crazy restrictions and shutdowns, and we have friends that are in California as pastors, and they're going through ridiculous fines imposed on just dumb levels.
Yeah, well, one of our friends has got a $2.5 million fine right now by the state because
And counting.
and counting. It's going up every week because he refuses to shut down. State says shut down. He said, "I'm not going to shut down."
Wow.
That's what was going on in the Great Awakening.
Well, and to the point of even the growth, if you look in California, we were just talking to one of our good friends who's a pastor out there, and they already had several thousand members in their church, but they're one of the churches that said, we're going to be open, we're going to minister to people, we're going to help people. He told us last weekend they had more than 25,000 adults, not kids, not youth, the adults in service. They've never seen numbers like this.
10 times as much.
Correct.
that's right.
And this is one of those things where it's becoming apparent that God is doing something in the midst of opposition, in the midst of friction, which the first and second Great Awakening, it was defined by a lot of opposition, a lot of friction. So even as we look at the friction and opposition and frustration and division in the nation, that's not inconsistent with Great Awakening.
So let me go back and just amplify on something you said. The first Great Awakening led to the Revolution. The Second Great Awakening led to the Civil War.
Yeah.
So a Great Awakening doesn't always, it's not something that people would like,
See,
but it changes
Yes,
the
it
course
does.
of the
Because
nation.
what it does is you've had bad thinking going along for a while. Great Awakening comes along, starts changing your thinking, and you start saying, that's bad, like slavery. The Second Great Awakening unquestionably led to the Civil War, and people say, well, it wasn't about slavery. Read the documents of the secession states. They
It
said it's
wasn't
about slavery.
only about slavery.
It was primarily about, and so it was about slavery. And so that's where denominations split, because in the Second Great Awakening, they're saying, look, God made everybody equal. Read Acts 17, read Revelation 7, and no, there's not equal, there's differences. And so denominations split over that biblical teaching that was growing. And the ministers, some very prominent ministers, Charles Finney and others, were very strong with that. And they finally come to the part and say, we're just not going to put up with slavery anymore. And that's going to stop, man. That creates a civil war.
Well,
they weren't trying for a war, but when you start changing, see, and this is what we're having right now. I think this is an interesting thing about an awakening, is you start with the thinking really goofed up in people. I mean, it's just really wrong. And it's not biblical as genders. You know, so many things. We're wrong on things that used to be so simple. Nobody questioned. And so as you start pushing back and saying, no, that's wrong. There are two genders. You get a lot thrown back at you. And so the conflict kind of starts over thinking and drawing a line and saying, no, there are rights and wrongs. And it's interesting, in the previous Great Awakenings, it was not the secular community that fought the thinking change. It was the Christian community.
Wow.
It was other ministers who, and as Tim mentioned, the split of denominations. You had the Methodist denomination, Presbyterian denomination, Baptist denomination split. The church turned on itself. And we do a lot of polling with national pollsters like George Barna and others. And with 384,000 churches and senior pastors in America, George, calling 500 today, has documented that about 72% of current pastors say they disagree with fundamental teachings of the Bible. I mean,
That's
simple
terrible.
teachings like Jesus lived a sinless life.
Like Warnock in Georgia, who is
Exactly.
using the Bible
Correct.
to justify abortion or
right.
homosexuality. That's just,
He's a minister, and he's in MLK's church.
I know, that's what
It's
amazes
just-
me.
So you've got, this is where the division first starts, is the church turns on itself, and you have those, if you will, less biblically thinking Christians turning on the more biblically thinking Christians, and it starts there. And so if you go back to George Whitefield, when he was preaching across America for all the time he was, in the early years, it was church pastors telling their parishioners, when Whitefield preaches, you go out there, you pelt him with rocks, you throw potatoes at him, throw cabbages at him, get up he's preaching in the woods, open pulpit, get up in the trees over him, pee on him and defecate on him. This is pastors,
Really?
pastors telling their church people to do this to the Great Awakening preacher. So, you know, that's significant, but it is, again,
And
the
so
church.
if you could just imagine that somehow or another the news media was subject to those pastors and encouraging their people to do it, how would they have reported this first Great Awakening? They would have reported it similar to our media
Sure.
today,
That's right.
reporting on the conservative Christians.
You bet. And it's interesting too, even thinking about the ministry of Jesus. His greatest opposition was not from government officials necessarily. It actually was the Pharisees, right? And he points out that you care more about the traditions of men than the things of God. It's interesting, as you're seeing some of the opposition, the friction in America today, there's no way that you can argue from a biblical standpoint in favor of abortion, right? In favor of sexuality outside of male and female, inside of a marriage covenant union, things that are not confusing. It's not complicated. And one of the things that we try to point out when we do pastors' conferences is we tell them nobody in your congregation should ever be confused about an issue that's not confusing in the Bible. And if they are, you probably haven't been teaching it well or correctly. And this is where we're seeing way too many Christians who are confused by very simple biblical issues
Absolutely.
that the Bible covers in multiple areas. But you think about Jesus, this is what he dealt with.